Hi, I'm John Atack, and we have hauled Spike out of the basement factory, and he's going to be allowed today to join in with the grown-ups.
Oh, how wonderful.
And she'll be able to sew the footage together later. So for those of you who are sensible enough to be watching this and not too insensible to be understanding it, our project to haul Spike out of abject poverty into dire poverty is progressing well, but we could still do with a few more dollars in the box. So
in the words of one of our friends, I had passed the grade 2 abject poverty release.
That's it, yeah. So the bridge to
like Scientology's. Gotta love it.
Yep. The bridge to being able to eat enough. Something like. Anyway, today we are going to, and who knows, this might be split up into various bits or who knows, but we're going to look at one of the more important aspects of the work that we're engaged with, which is the 8 deadly sins of thought reform.
Often mentioned, but we hadn't broken them down yet.
Yeah, that you can skip off and hear me talking about them in the audible version of Opening Our Minds, or you can read it.
Description below.
Yeah, but it's been very important to me. I first encountered these points reading what's it called, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism.
Mm-hmm.
Where Robert Jay Lifton, a psychiatrist, had interviewed 25 people who were survivors of the thought reform camps in China, established by Mao Zedong actually before he came to power in October 1949. He'd already had, I think, 200,000 people had gone through the thought reform program, which we must not call brainwashing. Even though the Chinese called it brainwashing, apparently we're not allowed to, because there's no such thing as brainwashing.
Oh, yeah, because then we delve into science fiction. And it's often used to debunk our field by using, I call it a straw man.
It is absolutely a straw man. And just as a quick reminder for anybody who has swallowed the argument put forward by sociologists that it has been proven that there is no such thing as brainwashing, I'd recommend this book called, Brainwashing, by Kathleen Taylor, who happens to be a professor of neuroscience at Oxford University. So she differs in her findings in the evidence, a neuroscientist, from the sociologists who say this doesn't happen. Of course, there is influence. Of course, influence can be excessive. And of course, it can undermine our reasoning. So no matter how good our critical thinking skills, we are emotional creatures who occasionally think.
Well, it's just like any straw man. The actual concept that's rejected is much simpler than the nuanced and complex system of influence that actually happens. Yeah.
And the reality is that a program did occur, that it did affect those who were put through it. It was a program that included physical constraint. People were jailed. This happened again in Xinjiang, where 1 million.
Still happening?
Well, there's been no new satellite footage. It would appear that the camps have been emptied. Okay. But where they've been emptied to is another matter.
Oh, just like SP Hole was shut down and actually they were moved to, what was it? Big.
For those who are not Scientologists among us,
yes.
SP Hole is where David Miscavige imprisoned for, I think, 8 years, all of the senior executives of Scientology. And it was a double trailer.
I'll put my picture on file up.
Packed into it. It's horrible. But this program did take place. And it's resurfaced thought reform, re-education, seminal, or brainwashing, to use the Chinese term. Mythologically, it was a story told by a man called, is it Edward Hunter?
Yes, and I've got that book cover too.
Yeah, and factually, he didn't start the story. He wasn't the first person to use the expression brainwashing in the English language. That is an honor that belongs to the Times of India in January 1950. His first mention of the term was in September of that year. So I'm afraid that 99% of the texts on this subject are in fact wrong. And I've seen the Times of India, and it had nothing to do with the CIA or Edward Hunt or anything else. It's just it's what everyday Chinese people called the program. They called it, and it's a joke that has a basis in the Confucian Analects, and the washing of the heart, the washing of the mind, because Confucius and traditional Chinese folk believe that thinking took place in the heart, is it's not necessarily held to be a bad thing. It's taken on all of this sort of, but it was a bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it is a bad thing, and many lives were destroyed as a consequence of this program. The 25 people whom Robert Jay Lifton interviewed extensively, 24 of them by this time had already rejected the teachings of communism, and that is put forward to say, you see, it doesn't work. Well, yeah, it doesn't work when you take something out of the environment which sustains the ideas. But I think it has worked in terms of China itself.
And by the way, while they were in that system, I mean, there were a handful of them that were Catholic priests that not only said, okay, our church is wrong and communism is right, but also said things like our church is part of a international spy network, and made up all of this stuff, and then wondered why once they stepped out, they wondered, how did I do this? Why did I say this? Which is something very familiar to a lot of cult members, former cult members. They get out, they go, why did I believe this crazy stuff?
Yeah. And in many cases, why did I allow these things to happen? Why did I participate in these events? And Robert J. Lifton started undoing this. He wanted to understand, and it still does want to understand, what it was that had motivated the German and Austrian nations to murder so many Jews. And the Nazi Doctors is his book examining that more directly. I would absolutely recommend Destroying the World to Save It,
about Shinrikyo.
And more recently, Losing Reality, which has extracts from Lifton's work. To my mind, he is one of the great thinkers.
He is indeed. Also, I would say that it also can apply to, in the field of domestic violence, why doesn't she, or sometimes he, leave? Yeah. Why doesn't the abused spouse leave? I've heard it so many times. Well, as soon as he hits her and she doesn't leave, then it's her fault. It's like, no. There's so many different methods of control going on. And these 8 deadly sins, as we like to call them, are so vital. If you understand them, then you can see where the strings are.
Yeah. And it's worth saying that the very people who protest that this could never happen to them, they would never be stupid enough, are the easiest people to recruit into authoritarianism.
Yeah, we had a very interesting comment on a recent one, which was, well, some people call Scientology and the JW a cult, but I think without any a priori judgment, it's like, just hint, just because you use Latin does not mean you're not being foolish. And said, well, here's a test. If you're in a cult, then leave. That's my test. No, you have to look at what the controls are. And this is an excellent way of looking at the controls and what is happening.
Yeah, and we have to, one of the things, as you very well know, that I emphasized in opening our minds is that these are normal human behaviors which are amplified.
That's right.
So we very naturally can fall into any of these behaviors. And until such time as we have a perfect world, we should be a little bit cautious.
Well, that's why so many of the human predators, abusers, what have you, can get away with some of these, is because a lot of these are amplifications of our normal social mores that we use to keep society together. One thing that I've been looking at is Dungeons and Dragons and other tabletop role-playing game groups where there's a horror story about an over-controlling DM or an over-controlling player
What's
who,
a DM? Sorry,
oh, DM, dungeon master, sometimes called GM or game master.
not
They're the person that,
the president of South Vietnam
no,
or the
no,
head of Scientology. Just
no. They're the people that tell the story and then
yeah.
lead the players through the world. And you'll find that a lot of the time, the ones that are the problem players or problem game masters are the ones who everybody says, well, I know it sounds like, why didn't we leave at the time? But there was this and this and this and this we didn't understand. And we ignored the red flags because it was merely an augmentation of the normal rules we all use to be polite.
Yeah. And I mean, again, my book goes into it in
It does.
detail that we have groupthink, we have obedience, and we have manipulation. And when you push these three things together, you can get something like Russia attacking Ukraine at the moment.
Yeah.
The thought that the Russian people are not going, no, stop this, we don't want to do this.
Because they believe it's the denazification, which doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, well, some of them do, but enough of them do. Yes, the idea that a Jewish president is a Nazi is a little contradictory directly. Yeah. So, and of course, Putin is as close to a fascist dictator as you can get, unless you go to China or North Korea. So where should we start with this?
Well, you've got the list in order that Margaret Singer offered it, and you put in Opening Minds, and we start with milieu control.
I can remember disliking that immediately that I saw it, the idea that we were going to have a piece of French thrown at us straight away. Not that I dislike the French in any way, just I'm looking for things that are easy to explain. So the milieu is the environment. And it can be the people you're with, which I think is the most significant aspect of milieu, but it can be any environmental aspect.
Just as that before you locked me in the basement, I was working for my local Macy's, and they had a very, very good way of milieu control. Higher priced items are in darker rooms. People can move through zones of soundtrack being piped through. Used to drive me crazy. There were 4 different soundtracks for the juniors area alone. And you know how any store you go into, one of the big superstores, there's no clear way through. You have to do this convoluted path that will force you to buy more. Milieu control is used all the time in retail, also in fine dining. You go into a restaurant, the lights are subdued, there's little booths so that, it's everybody knows how to act. Or if you go into a large church, everybody knows how to act because the windows, the pillars, this is sacred space.
So we create an atmosphere in which a ritual will take place. And that extends further into what a group of people will do. So Lifton talks about the cell, the last cell you will be in thought reform camp. There'll be, say, 7 of you in there, and you have one more task, and after that you'll be set free. And you might well have been there for 2 years by this time, in horrible conditions, awful conditions. And your task is basically to scream and shout at the newbie who has been put in the cell with you. So the milieu is showing you that everybody disagrees with you. And that's the first part of the process of breaking somebody down, so that they can be more readily controlled.
Often called a hot seat.
Well, the hot seat is a very specific,
that is true, yeah,
device that has come out of the group around Mao. and it has found its way directly as the hot seat into quite a number of authoritarian cults. Hoyt Richards has talked about this before.
It was
And,
in Synanon. There was a form of it in my own group too.
Yeah, and it's the fundamental principle of self-criticism, that if you can get somebody to the point where they do not trust themselves, where they believe that they have an enemy, an invisible enemy inside them, you know, the reactive mind, the unconscious mind, the subconscious mind, demons, devils, dibooks, gadons.
And all these people yelling nasty things at you are helping you rid yourself of that.
Yeah, and the reality behind this, when, you know, and something that in fact Stalin learned from Mao, is the system of purging, as it's come to be known, whereby Mao at one point, before he was leader of the Communist Party, killed 1/4 of his own troops for anti-Bolshevik sentiments. And Stalin picked up this idea that you could kill people because they were anti-Bolshevik, whatever that means, you know. In fact, Bolshevik is a stage beyond ordinary communist, because it means you believe in the violent overthrow of the state by any means, as opposed to Menshevik. And Lenin was a Bolshevik.
Yes.
So the hot seat is part of the milieu controlling you. And that very, very significant thing, that if you feel completely undermined by the people around you or some person in your environment, it's time out is what you need. You need to get away from that influence. If anybody is bending you to their will, and you are doubting yourself, you're doubting your own perceptions, you're doubting your own virtues, your own understanding of the world, it's time to get some distance between you and the person or people who are doing that to you, because they're using milieu control, so that you're no longer in charge of yourself. You no longer have the locus of control, as psychologists put it.
And a lot of this will be excused using our next item, loading the language, where language is used in a certain way, to different terms are used in a different way to create an own language that will then excuse all of this as, oh, you're just learning, and it'll be put in the group's terminology. Scientology is the master at loading the language. You want to speak to this?
Yes, so Ron Hubbard left us 2 dictionaries, and I've been back and looked, and they're each actually about 600 pages long.
Yikes.
So 1,200 pages of definitions of neologisms, new words that he's created, or redefinitions of existing words.
Yeah.
Because he wrote that one way of controlling people is propaganda by the redefinition of words, the policy, and that he did it far more than anybody else has ever done it. You know, that Shakespeare did not add as many words to the language as Ron Hubbard. Thankfully, most of Ron Hubbard's haven't actually got into the language yet.
No, and so many of them are acronyms, which turns your brain almost into jelly.
Or initializations. Let's make that differentiation.
Oh, yeah, they're initialization.
ARC, we're talking about an initialization. This was, I think it was Steve Jones who pointed this out to me when we were at Dublin in 2015, and he's so polite. But he said, you know, people often mistakenly call something an acronym. An acronym is something that you can say.
Oh, yes, there's the difference.
Yeah, so
I should know that.
But it took me. I had to go looking to try and find what the word was for something. The BBC is not an acronym; it's an initialization.
Initialization. Okay, good to know.
Maybe Ron Hubbard made up a better word for it, and we just haven't found it yet.
Well, one of the things is, like, one of the strongest examples I can find is actually in Jehovah's Witnesses, where they are trained to say the truth and refer not to the sky is blue or the sky is gray or water is wet, you know, actual truth, but rather the group that they're in, the organization. Are you in the truth. And you keep saying that as Orwell, no, it wasn't Orwell. It was guy who wrote Brave New World.
Huxley.
As Huxley said,
Another
70,000.
Two old Etonians.
70,000 repetitions equals one truth. You keep thinking that you're in the truth, then you start convincing yourself that this organization is the truth because it's the truth.
Yeah.
Capital T.
And the other old Etonian, Eric Blair, George Orwell, he gives us the most marvelous text on this, which is the appendix to 1984. And as Andy Nolch has pointed out, I thoroughly recommend the debunking of Andy Nolch. It's my favorite of all the videos I've done. But as he's pointed out, John Adak doesn't think that 1984 is the greatest book ever written. And I don't. I think it's the weakest of Orwell's novels. I've read
Animal Farm is far better.
Well, Coming Up for Air is my favorite of his novels. But, he was a great writer. I've read a dozen of his books. I went and checked after Andy Nolch had sort of, because I wasn't saying it's a crap book. I was saying it's not as well written. But that was a little too subtle for the conversation we were having. He doesn't like Putin.
Well, that's another point of loaded language, is that it removes complexities. It removes subtleties. It also works as a great way to isolate the in-group from the out-group. One of the things is you were never a live-in member, so you still, as you say, talked to people outside the group. So you never really talked Scientologies. Now, I could switch
between. Yeah.
Yes, I know so many ex-Scientologists that still use Scientologies. And if I hadn't studied y'all for so many years, I would be lost talking to them, even though they've been out for decades. Because
sometimes it's very subtle that a phrase is repeated. So, for example, blame, shame, and regret. There was a critic of ours, who we will not name, who in a TV documentary said that she felt no blame, shame, and regret, which was not in fact true from my experience of her. But if you're not a Scientologist, you wouldn't understand that she's actually talking about what are held to be 3 emotional tone levels that are below death.
Ah, yes.
According to Hubbard, everybody's dead. We're all zombies.
Well, we're raw meat, dead in the head.
Dead in the head. And so there are these 3 levels: blame, shame, regret, which is where Ron Hubbard and many of his followers are stuck. When the word reasonable is used,
yes,
as a psychologist, it means the opposite of the dictionary definition. It's a bad thing being reasonable.
Yes, I actually had that with a very dear friend that I was talking to, and we were working out a thing, and she at one point said, "You're being reasonable," and she meant it in the Hubbard sense.
Yeah.
And if I hadn't known that little bit, I would have been flummoxed.
And there is, as is often the case with Hubbard, there are already words for this. It's called rationalizing or intellectualizing. That's what he meant, that people are overthinking something, or acting to the letter of the law rather than the spirit of the law.
It does create a wall, though, between the non-believers and the rest of the world. Even in my group, we had a very specific way of speaking, code words for things, so that if we were sitting in the coffee shop talking about something, people would have no idea what we were talking about. They would think we were talking about some kind of dorm room drama when we were talking about all sorts of crazy stuff that I still am amazed I believed.
Well, I haven't met anybody yet that doesn't believe nonsense or hasn't believed nonsense at some point. We're all children and we all need to grow up. But it becomes extreme. Loaded language is really important to understand, because it can make somebody seem knowledgeable. So a priori, as you said, if somebody uses Latin, so lawyers in this country from the 1980s onwards, Latin was stripped out of legal speak because it was seen to be confusing. But doctors will still, go off and talk about they won't use a word like bruise. I think it's a hematoma, is it?
Yes, hematoma. That's why I recommend to anybody the best course that you can take to be aware of stuff in science and in medicine is to take a course in etymology. It was the most useful course I took in all the years of my schooling.
Is to say the origins and derivations of words.
Yes, not to be confused with entomology, which is the study of bugs.
Oh. Absolutely, which we will not be talking about.
No
at all. And so it can, there's the sense of an inner group that you're joining up with something, that you're inside the language. And language, all well in the essay Politics in the English Language, which is still used on courses in journalism, talks about the way that a word can shift its meaning. He uses the word egregious, and he says it now means both shocking and surpassing. So it can mean a positive or a negative, which is wicked.
Wicked is wicked good around here. Wicked good. Them socks are wicked good, man.
Well, Clint Eastwood interviewed Dr. John, Matt Rabenak, and Dr. John said, well, I realized that there were a lot of bad guitarists. And Clint Eastwood stops and says, by bad, do you mean good?
Yeah. Well, it also creates, as you said, a sense of elitism.
I realized there were a lot of egregious guitarists.
And also it directs the thought.
The thing is that, as Orwell points out, when you constrain language, you constrain thought. And
exactly.
He says in the appendix, and everybody should read this appendix, it's quite short. I wouldn't necessarily say that everybody should struggle through 1984. So Andy Nolcher's
such a downer.
It's and there's a terrible conflict in it, which I did point out in the debunking Andy Nolch thing, which is there for anybody who wants to look at conspiracy theories and how to respond to them, because I respond to everything that he said in his attack on me, every line of it. But the problem is that you cannot commit a thought crime if you do not have the words to think, as Orwell points out. And that's very true, that we become boundaried. We run on the tram lines of our language, and language becomes a trigger. So that if you, and try this at home, when a Jehovah's Witness comes to your door, be nice to them. That's the first thing. But ask them how they feel about Armageddon, and see how their face changes when you use the word Armageddon. It's a terrifying word, this battle. It's the end of the world before Jesus will come back and save us all. It's been a bit of a wait so far.
They have little go packs.
Yeah, to be ready for. There's a great episode of 6 Feet Under where it always started with somebody dying who'd then have to go to the funeral home, and this woman, these two young lads have got some blow up dolls, and they've blown them up with gas, and tied them to the top of their station wagon, and they're driving along, and the rope comes loose, and this woman walks into the parking lot and sees these bodies floating up and believes that the rapture is happening, and walks in front of the car. But
those blow-up dolls aren't all that realistic, though.
Well, she might not be that close to them, though,
Or have I
floating up in the sky, But then it's funny, and well, let's not do
fair
that.
Enough. Well, that's actually starting to verge onto the next one. Mystical manipulation.
Tell us about mystical manipulation, Spike.
Mystical manipulation is, I also like the term planned spontaneity, where either you take credit for something that happened and say that it happened because of your mystical powers, or you create the illusion that you have mystical powers through sleight of hand or other jiggery pokery. One of the ones that happened in my own group was I used to love don't do this at home, kids. Taking a cigarette lighter and lighting creamer packets, those little half and half packets that come with coffee.
UHT packets we have, ultra heat treatment milk.
Yeah. Well, and when I drove home that night, somebody's barn caught on fire on my way home. According to my leader, that was because I'd annoyed him by lighting creamer packets on fire. And that was my punishment, was to have the karmic guilt of that family's barn burning down. Now that's one. The other one is in your book, Opening Minds, Sai Baba.
Opening our minds now.
Opening our mind. What did I call it?
Opening minds.
Oh, golly gee, I'm sorry. Bad Spike, no biscuit.
I'm very hurt by that.
Bad Spike, no biscuit. Anywho, in Sai Baba, he had a little kneeler that people would go in to sit in the presence, and he had it wired just slightly so that you feel the tingle of being in his presence.
And a Japanese camera crew got a shot of the wires leading to it.
Mm-hmm.
I had a very strange experience, which I can probably talk about. That for some years I worked with a family whose son had become involved with Scientologists many years ago. Lovely people. And after I'd known them for about 2 years, they told me they were followers of Sai Baba. And I was like, oh, this would be brilliant. This is something you can introduce this conversation with. And I got a very stony look, and it's like, he's a fraud. He did the magic ash, where you rub your fingers together and you suddenly got ash in your hand. Which is it? You can buy it in a store. It's just a trick that's been used for years.
One of the ones that floats around the New Age community, and again, do not try this at home because this will actually potentially harm you, is rubbing your eyes so much that you feel the sparks. And they say, see, you're finally seeing auras. No, your eyes are telling you stop that.
I mean, my dear friend Gail Benton, who was with Maharaji, the Ilan Vital, the Divine Light Mission, he's called Prem Nawat now, and he is the Supreme Lord of the Universe, by the way, as of course is his mother and his brother as well. Various members of the family are the Supreme Lord of the Universe now, but they actually push their thumbs into their eye sockets as they meditate, and they have these elbow rests. And I desperately wanted some of these elbow rests. I thought, but you're actually, you're physically potentially damaging your sight by doing this to get this response. When the Berlin Wall came down, the Transcendental Meditation community claimed it was because they'd been meditating.
Didn't
which
Scientology claim that too?
Sorry?
Didn't Scientology claim that they caused that too?
Probably, yeah. And
that was, sorry, that was that was actually something that drew me in, because my experience was kind of unique in that it only started with me and the guy that would become our leader, and other people accreted around us, so that I was kind of his first disciple pre-group. But the thing that I remember when I first met him was he was sitting in the same coffee shop that I liked to hang out at, and he was talking about the KKK were coming to town, to Toledo, Ohio. And he was saying that he was going to send the goddess Kali after them. And then what happened, and you can look this up, is there was an unprecedented heat wave that week in Toledo. And the next week I saw him, he was bragging about how he'd gotten Kali to sweat those bastards out. Here's another pro tip: just because they're against somebody nasty doesn't mean they're not nasty themselves.
No, and there are groups that will latch on to particular ideas and use that as to justify them. So you'll find an authoritarian group that is very noisily opposed, quite rightly, to paedophile grooming. But it doesn't mean that the group is any good. Ron Hubbard in Scientology talked about having to have the appearance of a charitable organization. He's quite open about this. You've got to act as if you're this thing. And so you see their little volunteer ministers, their T-shirts going out to, if there's been a hurricane somewhere or something, to get lots of publicity,
What's the phrase from Magnolia? How to pretend as if you are nice and caring?
Yeah, like you are nice and caring. Yeah, how to look like you're nice and caring. That is a brilliant film. It really isn't. Much as I disagree with Tom Cruise's bizarre beliefs, it's a fine performance in that film. But perhaps close to his real self as well, because he does seem to have played smarmy con men and bullies throughout his career.
Yeah, risky business, and then from there.
Wire.
So yeah,
Color of Money, The Rain Man. Yeah.
So mystical manipulation is the planning of making yourself look like you're really the big biz when really you're just a charlatan.
Yeah, and you might be the big biz. The Byzantine emperor, one of the most powerful people in the world, at Constantinople, what's now Istanbul, but the part of the Roman Empire that persisted until 1452. The Roman part collapsed, but the Western Empire, but the Eastern Empire, he was a very powerful man. And they had this elevator system where his throne would rise and you would see him coming out in a different costume at each level, as if there was some magical power involved. And that's so often the case with so many groups that there's some way of making, if you just looking at the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, the three palaces that these people had, you can't help but be overawed by it. The magnificent cathedrals, there is this idea of a competence beyond what is normal, of the ability to perform miracles, and all sorts of tricks will be played.
I was just thinking of the tricks of the atomic priesthood in the Foundation, in Isaac Asimov's Foundation novels.
There you go.
Very similar to that floating throne where the regular folks, the hoi polloi, actually don't know about levitation devices and motors and things like that. But the priesthood does know that it's just a machine that's lifting the king up and floating by on his throne. So that's mystical manipulation.
It is. And it's very bad and people shouldn't do it.
Don't do it. So sacred science?
Sacred science. And this allows us to say that we can move between the poles of saying that what we believe is scientific and what we believe is sacred. And again, exemplified in Scientology by the e-meter, the electropsychometer, which is a pretty basic machine. I don't know about quotes on the current one, but when they were making the Mark VI, Texas Instruments quoted them $38 a unit to manufacture them, and they were sold for $2,000. So, and they just use the cheapest components. Hopefully, now they're using slightly more expensive stuff. The problem is, and so you get to this thing where I talked with this guy, and he got involved with Scientology in 1954. And I asked him, he'd said that it was very skeptical when Hubbard had released this thing about us being packed with all these little spirits that had been packaged together 75 million years ago in volcanoes and given 36 days of hypnotic implanting by the Prince Zeno. He said he read this and he thought it was just nonsense. And this was a feeling I got from a lot of the people who got involved in the 50s. Hubbard laid that on everybody in 1967. Well, he didn't actually. It was a secret, and you had to progress up and all of that stuff. I'd been in for 7 years before I was allowed sight of it, and I pretty much felt the same way.
What is it, like $500,000 before you get to this level?
It's in that region now, yeah. I mean, my whole Scientology career, which was 9 years long, I paid £9,000. That's the lot, and so I could just about afford it. But yes, the prices went up rather. But so I said to him, well, but you did OT3, you read it, you thought it was nonsense, but you did it. Why did you do it? He said, well, I thought I'd check it out on the e-meter.
Mm-hmm.
And I said to him immediately, and did you check the e-meter out? And he said, oh, didn't think about that. So it's a sacred science, this very good example of sacred science.
I'm just thinking of a lot of the dowsers conventions that I used to go to, where it would be just assumed that these lumps of rock, labradite, calcite, all of these quartz crystals would have these properties. Well, why do they have them? Well, because everybody knows, and you just couldn't question. One guy was trying to convince me that because he'd laid a whole bunch of crystals on this little piece of laminated paper with a grid drawn on it, that he was clearing the energy of the room. Or one lady who, I'm not a violent person, John, but what?
Not generally.
Not generally, but I swear the closest I'd ever gotten to really wanting to punch somebody was this one woman who, after telling me, oh, you're dyslexic, I can douse that away from you, said, oh, you work with Alzheimer's patients. Well, you know what their problem is? They're just not trying hard enough.
Yeah, that plaque clears from your brain as soon as you try hard enough.
Yeah, but the whole idea that this waving this a pendulum or the little L rods or whatever, we've even got still L rods in this room over there.
There you go.
Rod
Hubbard.
As I haven't gotten rid of my stuff since believing in this stuff. So anybody wants to buy 30 tarot decks?
Or anybody wants, 60 bankers boxes of Scientology material, I'd be very happy to sell it. I've bloody had enough of it. It's no use to me.
But all of this, why does it work? Because you believe in it. And if it doesn't work, well, you didn't believe in it enough.
And it's fascinating how many of these mythologies are modern. They come from Helena Blavatsky in the 1870s, who was thoroughly discredited during her own lifetime, under investigation by the very friendly British Psychical Research Society. But that was the first job they did, and she was shown to be a fraud. But ideas, the Aryan race theory fundamentally comes from her. But so many of these ideas, years ago, I sat with a guy, I went to Glastonbury. It can happen. Lovely place. And it's what a strange community there. So many sort of hippies who've washed into this place. And this guy was an expert on ley lines. And I was fascinated by this idea that, lines of force, an energy that you can draw from, that run throughout the country. And so in talking to him, I said, well, how do you determine where they are? And he said, well, you just take a map, and wherever there are churches, you connect them together. And he pointed out that, and this one is strange, that if you looked at the ley line map for St. Hill Manor, the centre for Scientology in south of London, there is 5 overlapping ley lines. There is a pentagram that surrounds this. There is the mark of Satan, and in the middle of it is L. Ron Hubbard's manor house. But this thought that, so the science behind this is you get a ruler and an ordnance survey map with churches on it, and you draw lines, and you've just proved that these energy lines are running, If you go older, you can go for feng shui, the Chinese principle. I knew a record executive, a man called Mark Dean, who worked at Atlantic Records, and he's the guy who first signed George Michael and Wham back in the day. But he had his apartment feng shui. He'd been in Scientology. He'd given them like £60,000 or something, and was trying to get it back, which is why he was talking to me. And he said, this thing about having coal by the door and never leaving the toilet lid up because of all the bad energy that comes through the sewers, and having your salt in the right place, and also these amazing constructions that people become involved with that become the truth. There's that word again.
Mm-hmm. And the proof is just, you have to believe it. And if it doesn't work and you can't prove it, well, you didn't believe hard enough. That is one of the other things. One of the time when I finally said, okay, I can't believe, I still feel, a certain reverence for the earth and all of its creatures and observing the cycles. But I'm going to be very unpopular here. As far as I'm concerned, neo-paganism has been taken over by a community that A, didn't understand it, and B, throw in a lot of garbage that is all just sacred science, bull pocky about auras and crystals and dolphins. And I was talking one day and I was just venting about some issues that I was having. And this woman walks up to me and says, you chose your parents. And how can you prove that? Well, I work with babies. The whole idea with sacred science is that you take what constitutes scientific proof and you throw it out the window, and it's true if you believe in it, which is another great Hubbardism.
What's true for you is true.
I like to illustrate it with the parrot sketch, Monty Python's parrot sketch.
It's not actually dead. It's pining for the fields.
Because, and why isn't it working? Well, because you're not letting it work. And this was from
out to the perch.
Well, this was from a real life example. Michael Palin had what I must imagine must be a very annoying car guy who would just, the door came off. Well, they're meant to do that.
Designed that way.
Yeah, it was designed that way. And the white wipers don't work. Well, they're not working because you've been using them wrong. And when everybody tells you, well, this hasn't worked for you because you didn't believe in it, it's a big sign.
When we go down that whole route of the law of attraction, the secret, Christian Science, and various strange Christian sects that have decided that God wants them to be rich. And when Jesus said, he who would follow me must give all that he has to the poor, he didn't really mean it.
Or that what you say can affect the universe will listen to what you say and suddenly affect that. Anybody who wants to do that, say, I can fly over and over again, and just then step off the top of a building, please. No, I didn't say that. But like a very dear friend of mine, when I first started working for you, I said, I've got my dream job. I'm working for this author. We're doing all this neat stuff. I can't believe my luck. And she said, no, don't say that. The universe will listen and take it away from you.
Yeah, it's one of those things, isn't it, that when you, as Americans say, do the math, there are 7.25 billion human beings, all wishing and hoping and praying and dreaming in a galaxy that has, 100 billion stars in it. That's one of 100 billion galaxies, meaning that there are quite a lot of us. And if you take the Hindu version, that everything, Leibniz, everything has a soul, every creature has a soul. And when a giant clam gives birth to 2 billion little clamlets, who will become Scientologists in future lifetimes, according to Oren Hubbard's ideas, that there, and all of the ants and all of that stuff, all of this stuff, wishing and hoping and praying and dreaming, how can that possibly work? And where is this universal ear? It's like when you looked at and I've banged on about this before, but the Akashic records, the idea of karma, the lords of karma, to make this mechanism work, somebody has to be overseeing every action of every baby giant clam and every ant and every bacterium and every viral particle, and making sure that they're all in the right place at the right time for the right misfortune to happen. So if 400 people are on an airplane and it goes down, they and all of their bacteria, by the way, this is the right point in their karma. It's impossible.
Oh, and also they died because they weren't thinking the right things. You know that I'm a true crime addict. I love me some true crime. But the one thing that really annoys me is when somebody had survived, or even the right clue was found at the right time to find the person who had killed them. Well, God was directing them. It's like, if God was directing them, wouldn't they have not been killed? And also, are you then saying that all the people that did get killed by this guy, God didn't care about? Or even just a football game? Well, God was behind us, and I'd like to thank God for helping us win this football game. So God didn't like the other side as much?
Praise God and pass the ammunition.
Yeah. So, and that gets us interesting. Did Margaret Singer put these in this order because they led so nicely together?
It's the flow through in she talks about it in Cults in Our Midst and explains.
Excellent book.
It's still remarkable.
That and Steve Hassan's Combating Cult Mind Control were the two books that helped me untangle myself.
Yeah.
Shortly before we met.
Yeah.
Okay.
I met Margaret just before Cults in Our Midst came out. And it is terrible the way that her name and reputation have been attacked.
Oh, awful. That's
she was a quite remarkable person. By the time I met her, which was 1993, she had counseled 2,000 former members of authoritarian groups and not charged a penny for doing so. And there's this fabulism made up in the kind of Alex Jones community that she was somehow, and this has been repeated by no less than Adam Curtis, one of the great documentary makers, made this stupid lecture, which is on YouTube, where he's, this brilliant investigative journalist believes what is fundamentally Scientology's hate pack, that Margaret Singer went round the parents of hippies who were joining the Children of God and persuaded them to kidnap and deprogram these kids. And Curtis actually says that the only damage ever caused to members of new religious movements, as he calls them, is by kidnapped deprogrammers. And the thought that somebody had been systematically raped in the Children of God from the age of 3 would not be damaged by that because we're going to call the group a new religious movement. It's just asinine. It's unbelievable. But these things happen. Even a great journalist and investigator like Adam Curtis, and The Century of the Self, for example, or The Power of Nightmares, he's just produced so much work that challenges the way we think, which is, and I don't necessarily agree with him, but I am very happy to be challenged. And then he does something where he hasn't bothered to research. And Margaret Singer becomes, is attacked by him. And it is so incredibly unfair.
It is indeed. It is indeed. I feel the same way about Neil deGrasse Tyson and his statements on Scientology. Here's this brilliant guy who has the ear of just about everybody on the planet, and he says, oh, it's no worse than Catholicism.
Well, it depends what period in Catholicism we're looking at.
This is true. This is true. And also, we don't want to get into too many tangents, though, because I was wanting to move us into.
No, let's get into too many tangents. How many is
I don't know. I have a tangerine here.
No. That's not going to work, I'm afraid.
Sorry, bad spike. No
keep your tangerine dreams to yourself.
But in the sacred science, the idea that you have to be some up here to get it comes the demand for purity. That is, you have to be pure. You have to do this. In Scientology, you can't. There's a certain list of things you can't do before you have processing, up to and including speaking to anybody who, like us, SPs.
Anybody who criticizes Scientology, that will mean that you are a potential trouble source, which I think is absolutely true, to Scientology.
I know I will have come into my own when I get my own stand page. As it is, I think I may be mentioned as a footnote on yours.
So they're
I
really,
know.
they talk about hate campaigning and then do that, you know.
I know. Come on. Where's my Stan League page?
Well, what about Chris Shelton? I mean, why don't they go after Chris, you know?
They do.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear that.
The son that he's now in contact with and pleased his punch and went down and visited and everything, he's a deadbeat dad. And it's like, no, Scientology kind of tore that relationship and that kid away from him for so many years, you know?
So often the case.
But like in Jehovah's Witnesses, you can't smoke, you can't drink. No, you can drink. In fact, it's an open joke that Bethel, their alcoholism rate is ultra high.
Is the headquarters.
Their headquarters, yes, sorry. But that you can't listen to this music, you can't wear certain things, you can't wear certain jewelry. You can't, I believe you can't have beards. You can have a mustache, but that's up to individual conscience. But all of this list of you can't do all of this, otherwise you're not pure. And you can't, a lot of the religions, you can't be gay, you can't be bi, you can't live in sin. All sorts of things where you have to be pure and you have to keep your mind pure and your life pure and stay away from things.
And it's interesting to see that the purity is seen in different ways in different cultures.
This is true.
I was very surprised to find that, you know, the peculiar attitudes towards sex that were introduced into Christianity, I believe, by Saint Jerome in the 4th century. They have, you know, yes, you have Origen castrating himself and regretting it later, and we have St. Paul saying it's better to marry than to burn. I'm not sure, you know. It can be worse to marry than to burn, in my experience. But you can
you let us know in a couple of months.
Oh no, this one's going to be great. This one's going to be good.
Yes, this one is. We like her.
Learned our lessons. You know, I have learned from my mistakes. So there's not one of them that I could not repeat exactly. But this idea, you'll find all sorts of prohibitions in Judaism about the cleanliness of a woman when she's menstruated and all of this sort of stuff. It was interesting to me to find that the attitude towards sex in Chinese tradition is quite different than the attitude that we find in Christianity. And indeed, and I'm not saying this is a good thing, far from it, but among certain Taoist scholars, they have the belief that part of their practice is to have sex with as many partners as possible. So that they can take the chi, the vital energy,
the vital
from
bodily fluids.
Well, the vital bodily fluids do come into it. A significant practice among, let's call them yogins. Let's steal a word from the Hindus. Among Taoist yogins is that men are not meant to ejaculate, and they, you know, you have the secret of the golden flower, which Jung was very interested in. And it's fundamentally learning how to get your semen to travel back inside you. And it's meant to travel up through your system pretty much along this.
Sounds like asking for prostate cancer.
It absolutely would be. But you know, again, in terms of the incredible bias in Western culture, the Levantine, you know, Judeo-Christian Islamic traditions against women, that among these Taoist sages, there are female sages, and they go around collecting the vital energies of men, and just realizing that it's not an aspect of nature. It would appear that incest, for example, is a taboo that runs not only through human beings, but is found among bonobos. So there is this awareness of something dangerous there. And that really does bring us to the demand for purity, that this idea of maintaining breeding, selective breeding, to create, you know, Himmler was trying to create to bring back the superpowers, the electron powers of the Aryan people through the Lebensborn, the freely born program, and of which the dark-haired woman in ABBA was a Lebensborn child, and maybe does have superpowers. I don't know.
She's got a killer voice.
Well, yes,
That's
sir.
voice.
I can boogie. I can boogie all night long. You know, maybe that's a superpower. I don't think it's what Himmler was thinking of, though.
No,
so,
no.
But this idea of purity of race is also, and you look at it and you say, well, actually, genetically, you're going to be in real trouble if you start doing that. You'll start getting the Habsburg chin, for example. You know? The various kinds of madness that have run, like Porphyria in our own royal family in Britain here. These will be passed on. So by becoming pure, you know, things can go totally the wrong way.
Well, also then the whole idea of spiritually pure, and also, and women being that evil thing in the IFB, Independent Fundamentalist Baptist. This kind of shirt here, this is called an eye trap. Because this line here, it leads right down to my boobies, and that'll inflame any man who sees me, and the men, they just can't control it, and it's all my fault because I wore this shirt. I think and
maybe you should try one of those things that our prime minister called a letterbox, where you know, or just a hijab, I don't know, but that yes, this idea that men are uncontrollable brute beasts,
and that women, it's on the woman's responsibility to dress in a modest manner, and that if she wears something, well, and you still hear this, and I thought this was supposed to go out of fashion back in the 80s. Thank you very much. The idea of what were you wearing, but it seems to have come back into fashion lately. And but also the idea that you have to be pure in thought, and if you're not pure in thought, this goes back to our friends in the Secret and such. If you have a bad thought, that will create bad energy, and it means in Scientologies, you've pulled it in. And this to me is just victim blaming.
And it leads to the manipulation of guilt. And again, it's something to watch out for when somebody's getting you. And we are going to come. Do we come next to the cult of confession?
Yes, indeed we do. Give the man a cigar.
Thank you. I must take up smoking if you're going to give me a cigar. But that getting people to feel guilty, and you know, there are people who should feel guilty, but in my experience, they don't.
Yeah.
You know, when a political leader lies. We have a little thing going on here at the moment, which is BJ, as I like to think of him. What's funny about that? He of course, it's been found that he had 16 parties, having declared parties illegal during lockdown. He had 16 of them. He's been fined £50, which he's having to pay out of his own pocket money, for having these parties. And there's this, he stood up in Parliament and said that number 10 Downing Street, where he lived, they had followed all of the lockdown rules. And he's now got representatives standing up for him and saying, well, he's apologized. Isn't that enough? Yeah, no, he lied. So that's my personal demand for purity.
So maybe he should confess. Yes.
And so somebody gets you to confess the things that have troubled and upset you, that you feel guilty about. And if there are no things that you feel guilty about, you're a psychopath. Somebody gets you to confess these things, and they will then manipulate you and make you feel worse. One of the truly shocking things for almost anybody who's come out of an authoritarian cult is when they find out what the leader's been doing, and that they've been worried that they once, you know, had a little bar of chocolate worth 10 cents, a Hershey bar or something, that they stole from a store when they were 8 years old, and they're really upset about this. Margaret Singer, in fact, told this story about this guy who'd been convinced, I think by Scientology, that he was a junkie because he'd once had one hit on a cannabis spliff. And so the guilt is, and then you find out, leave Scientology, and I interviewed people in Hubbard's own teachings, in books that are still published by Scientology. He recommends amphetamines. He talks about having been a barbiturate addict, a phenobarbital addict, in one lecture. We find in Dianetics and Modern Science of Mental Health, he says quite rightly that alcohol is probably the most dangerous drug there is. He was an alcoholic, and he set up Narconon to, help people stop taking drugs.
He used all the drugs.
Well, he smoked 100 cigarettes a day.
Yeah.
And complained to his teenage crew, the messengers, that he wished he could give up. So evidently his Narconon program didn't work for him.
Mm-hmm.
He later found out that he was also using the opiate drug Demerol. And, seems to have concealed this very well, because one of those messengers, having written about this, who was with him for 11 years, pretty much every day, said she never saw him take a drug, and she only once saw him drink. And yet, by the time he died, his liver was shot from the amount of drink he'd had, and 100 cigarettes a day she will have seen. I think it is often true that people, when they take illegal drugs, do so in private.
Oh yeah. That's why the 2-witness rule doesn't work for Jehovah's Witnesses, where something will only be reportable if 2 people have seen it. Well, sexual predators do not abuse their prey in public where everybody can see it. But getting back to the confession, the one thing in Scientology that I find shocking is that all of these auditing sessions are taped, and everything you ever did goes into a folder, and priest penitent privilege be damned, go right out the window as soon as you leave. It's probably why Travolta's never going to leave Scientology, which is such a shame.
Yes, it is. He seems to be a nice man.
Yeah. I wish he'd come to his senses, come out of the closet, and come out of the cult.
Well, he did leave. He left in 82. He gave a negative interview to Rolling Stone. And it's, in fact, I talked with, I think, the person who was auditing him on the day he climbed out of the window, if I remember rightly, and ran away, gave an interview, and then, he was brought back. And it is suggested that, because he is fairly evidently gay, that they would use that to blackmail him. It's a very strange thing that Hollywood, of all places.
I know. It seems like most of the rest of the world has kind of moved on and gone, okay, except in Florida, of course. But getting back to the confession, the idea that I've got something wrong. Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. I know I am not worthy. And this idea that coming from the demand for purity, you have to confess, and only by confessing to us, the group, your church, your priest, your whatever, can you wash that away, or only by the blood of Jesus can you wash this away. And it's only through the group that you can get this out. But if you ever leave us or betray us, we will use all of that stuff that we said was washed away against you.
When Scientology got round it in an interesting way, when I was a member of Scientology, leaving in 1983, if you were in a so-called confessional, then you'd be asked, all sorts of intimate questions, and you'd respond to them. But this material would not travel into your ethics folder. It was considered to be confidential. Then a change came in that allowed them to say they didn't use material from confessionals, in that if you started to talk about something that was criminal or despicable, the auditor the counselor would suddenly stop and end the session and say, I'm now going to make a record of this for ethics. And so around the time I was leaving, this new procedure came in. And as you say, they videotape sessions. Yeah. It's like the collateral that was demanded in NXIVM, where you had to offer something that could be used to blackmail you later.
And if you didn't have something good enough, you had to make up something.
Yeah.
In my group, it was past life events. And the lifetime that I was supposed to have lived just before this one, I was a horrible, horrible, evil man.
You were.
Yes. And so that basically meant that since I'd confessed all of this and made up all of this stuff, I had to pay for it. And anytime I did anything bad, it was because, or anything bad happened to me, up to and including spousal abuse, it was because you had been, you confessed it, so it must be true. But yeah, NXIVM, the collateral, as Sarah Edmondson said in her brilliant book, Scarred.
Great book.
Great book, that she was forced to make up stuff, even, and talk trash about her family and loved ones, so that if she ever left, they could then send this to her family. So that confession becomes blackmail.
And even if it doesn't progress to that, the trust that is necessary to share deep secrets, it's extraordinarily important that you're in a relationship where that's possible. I question, back in the 80s, Kent Bertner, who was a Catholic priest, gave an incredible talk, I think called People in Glass Houses, in which he criticized his own church and the cultish aspects of it. He didn't remain a priest for very long after that.
I could imagine not.
And, it's long before the first admission, which was by Pope Ratzinger, I think, that yes, they'd been doing these things, and yes, they'd been covering them up. And we do get into a dreadful situation, where in Australia, 500 priests were found guilty of having molested 8,000 of their parishioners and their parishioners' children. So the cult of confession, the power that gives you, and the sense of purity that is given to the priest, that there's an interesting heresy, which is called the Donatist heresy. And the idea was put forward: if the priest is not pure, is the sacrament still blessed? And the Catholic Church's position is, yep, because he's received the charism, has the charisma passed to him, that even if he is the most awful of human beings, the bread and the wine are still the body and blood of Christ. And this flares up in the late 12th century, early 13th century, when the Cathars, the Albigenses, are in the southern part of what is now France. The Languedoc was its own principality at that time under Count Raymond of Toulouse, I think. And they say, no, the priest must be a parfait, perfect in their behavior, if what they're going to give as energy. The reason I bring this up is that if you're confessing to somebody who is not trustworthy, then you have just made yourself very weak. It's a really good idea to talk about the things that we've done that were wrong, that if we still feel guilty about them, to get rid of the shame that we might.
Yeah.
But it's a really bad idea if those things can then be used to diminish us, rather than helping us to become better and stronger people who can help others and do some good in the world, rather than sitting around bickering about whatever group they're in and how dreadful it was. But let's not get into that.
No, and then also also the idea that, well, it didn't happen the way that you think it happened. That's used a lot to deflect abuse. Like the Seagram's heiress just said that all of the Nixium people, they didn't really get abused. They're just looking for an easy payday. I also saw that in the excellent documentary Spotlight about the Catholic abuse. All those people who said that they'd been abused, they were just looking for money because the Catholic Church is so rich. And so the idea, and so I'm trying to move us into the next one here.
Well, before we go to the next one, let's bring up the vow that if somebody is going to say, it's all an invention, the vow is a remarkable document because, an Oscar-winning filmmaker was asked by Keith Raniere to document all of their conversations, to film everything. So what you're looking at is not somebody after the fact talking about what happened to them. You can see what was said in the vow. There's a lot of it. It's not short, but it's a very detailed analysis of real events. And so these glib denials are no longer plausible. It's like, Holocaust denial. There's a point where stupid is just stupid. It's all you can say. We had the piece I did with Ed Stratton, who is brilliant. And I wish I could. I'd still talk to him regularly, but he's not particularly wanting to record these last few months, which is I keep poking him. But his research on the Holocaust was just incredible. I think he listed 23 books just on the Holocaust, not on the Nazis. And among them, there's a 3-volume work which shows exactly how many people in every area of the Nazi Reich disappeared, how many Jews disappeared. And it does indeed add up to 6 million. If you take all of the massacres, all of the horrors in Russia, which is documented in the incredible film Come and See, one of the most horrifying, or things like the Baba Yar massacre. These things are historical, and somebody in the comments had put, that it was an exaggeration, this standard denier thing, and it's like, okay, how many people is it okay to murder? 10, 100?
It was only 2 million. It's like, no.
Why is it always 2 million? Where have they got this number from? I hear it again and again.
It's the one that's listed in that hateful documentary that actually defends the German, not the Germans, but the Nazi state.
Well, yeah, it's a perpetuated invention. And the point is that Eddie had gone through these 3 volumes and looked through all of this. The deniers just get it secondhand from, again, Rex Jones.
I knew people. I'm old enough to I served in a nursing home for umpteen years. I knew people with the tattoo, and a guy that we had to make sure every time we took him in the shower that he was under enough medication and calm and in a good enough headspace that when he got into the white tiled shower room, he wouldn't freak out. And, you can say it didn't happen all you like, but I'm sorry. I remember this fella, wonderful fella. He used to take off his yarmulke to eat bacon. I love it.
As we all should. Example to us all. Yeah. The point is that when you've got something with hundreds of thousands of witnesses, including, of course,
and survivors.
Yeah, but you've got everything. You've got the Sonnen Commando, who, many Poles who managed to have lighter duties by doing these horrific things, putting bodies in the crematoria. You've got former guards who testified after Nuremberg. They came forward after Nuremberg and said, I know that I may lose my life for confessing what I've done, but I have to confess it. And the details, when you add them together, but here is this problem that it doesn't matter how much evidence you've got, once somebody has made up their mind and developed certainty, and this brings us back to Robert A. Burton's wonderful book on being certain, which everyone should read, we have this sense of knowing, this feeling of knowing that makes us sure. And to grow up, to become an adult, to get out of and beyond adolescence, it becomes important to understand what is evidence and what isn't. Am I believing this because I want to believe it? You know,
and what research is. Research is not reading a couple of things on Facebook or taking drugs and thinking about something.
Taking ayahuasca and thinking that the royal family are lizards, as David Icke
Well, it does slide nicely in a doctrine over person, whereas you did not see what you thought you saw. That didn't happen. And the reason it didn't happen is because our group doesn't do that. One example, back to the domestic violence thing, is a child who will be told, no, I didn't do this piece of abuse to you. And the reasoning goes, I am a good parent. I would not abuse my child. Thus, even though you have the bruises, those aren't real because I'm a good parent and I did not abuse you.
Ideology over experience, doctrine over person.
Exactly.
Where one is expected to put aside the evidence of the senses, so that the doctrine will be true. And this is a very alarming, the way that the truth can be bent to fit into some preference of the leader.
Well, it's so ingrained in our culture. I'm thinking every gall darn Christmas movie where faith and belief is put forward as this big thing, and that not believing in Santa Claus is the worst thing you can do. And then no matter how much evidence is given that, no, one fat old man is not going to go all the way around the world with 8 little reindeer flying around the world and giving presents to all the Christian kids in one night. And all of the problematic things that go on with that. But belief is important, and you need to believe, and belief is more important somehow than logic.
Sacred science, the sanctity of doctrine. And it becomes so twisted and so tied up. 2 of my close friends are trained theologians. I enjoy having conversations with them about their beliefs because they don't get emotional about it.
Yeah.
And even though I don't share their beliefs, they're willing to talk with me about it, and it doesn't upset them. What tends to happen more often, and this can happen, that somebody can become emotionally caught up in any view and demand that other people agree. And so, atheist or theist.
My definition of atheist is this, thus, despite all the Oxford Dictionary definitions and the fact that everybody has a different definition of what an atheist is this day, it is this. And if you don't say this one, then you are somehow very wrong and angering me so much.
And you have abused me by disagreeing with me. That it has hurt my feelings horribly, but that people will grab hold of a belief, and you can see it among I've just read Deborah Blum's The Ghost Hunters, which really shook me. I read it because I read The Poisoner's Handbook, which is her book about the development of forensic science in New York from 1900 to the 1930s. And it shows how they found out how to prove certain kinds of poisoning and this kind of, and it's just, she's such a brilliant writer. So I went, here's this other book, The Ghost Hunters. Oh, it's about William James. So I'm fascinated by, brilliant psychologist. And to then find that James, and I didn't know this, and he's the guy that talked about feelings of knowing. by the way, and about that sense of certainty, so he was very savvy sort of character. He was a founder of both the British and the American Societies for Psychical Research. And the book actually is wonderful because it made me go, I'm feeling cognitive dissonance because I don't believe this type of thing anymore. I am agnostic. I don't believe. It's just that simple. I don't disbelieve, believe, but I don't really feel the necessity of any ghostly presences. And so reading a book these many years on in my own journey, having grown up in a Christian household, then been involved with Buddhism and Chinese philosophies, and then with Scientology, all before the age of 20, to now go, I couldn't care less about reincarnation, heaven and hell, the survival of the spirit, any of that stuff. It just, I take Zhuang Su's or Epictetus's view of this among the ancient philosophers. It really doesn't matter. What matters is being in the eternal now, eternally and now.
Yeah, I pride myself on the nebulousness of my own beliefs.
But here I am reading this thing, which is putting together, it's showing that some of the most serious scientists of their day in the late 19th century, including Nobel Prize winners in hard sciences, absolutely believed in these things and set up very serious ways of testing them. I think later on things like the Rhine Institute or the Stanford Research Institute were not as well set up, but that's just my opinion from what I've seen. But I found I was having to say, I mustn't have this fixed view. I must be willing to consider evidence, even though I'm getting that wobbly cognitive dissonance feeling, because the my side bias, the confirmation bias that I feel is now being challenged. At the end of the book, it was great, and I am going to spoil it. But Deborah Blum says, despite all of this, she's not convinced. And it's like, phew.
Yeah, I'll say, as big as Sherlock Holmes fangirl as I am, I was so disappointed to find out that Conan Doyle believed in all the Cottingley fairies, even after they'd been debunked, even after the girls came forward and said, those were cardboard cutouts. Sorry, Arthur.
You can see it in the photographs. You can see that they're cardboard cutouts with our slightly more sophisticated eyes. And the whole thing
fairy right over your shoulder with clever video editing.
Yeah, it's easily done, but it was you can see the edges of the cutout on those photos. Yeah. And then his whole thing with Houdini, where Conan Doyle's wife has a medium session where she writes this thing because Houdini, he'd lost his mum and he wanted to talk to his mum, and it got a Christian cross at the top, and then there's this text written, and Houdini looked at Mrs. Conan Doyle and said, well, I've got two problems with that. Firstly, she was Jewish, so I don't know what the cross is doing, and secondly, she didn't speak a word of English, so
yeah,
she's suddenly doing that. But the point is really that to be determined, there's a story that's told of a group of physicists who were shown a vase or vase, if you like, levitating. And two of the physicists said it didn't happen, it was a hallucination. Now, it did happen, but it was done using trickery. But the idea that two scientists would sit there and say, because it cannot happen, it did not happen.
It didn't happen, yeah. Yeah, and that's exactly what doctrine of person or ideology over experience is all about. You did not experience this because it doesn't fit into our box for you. Which moves us.
And so whatever experiences and beliefs you had when you come to an authoritarian who is going to restructure your thinking, you're going to have to put aside. I had a very simple one with Scientology. As a teenager, and this is going to shock you, I know. As a teenager at the age of 13, after I'd run away to Scotland with my girlfriend, and I blame her, she was a year and a half older than me, and absolutely gorgeous. She was lovely. But I was sent to see a psychiatrist because You know, I think if I'd run away with one of the other boys, that would have been fine. It was that kind of school. But, you know, I was sent to a psychiatrist, and psychiatrists, they put me through all these psychologists, all these tests and what have you. At the end of it said, no, there's nothing wrong with you. There's nothing to be treated. And I didn't think there was, but anyway.
Puberty, for God's sakes, and an affectionate person.
Well,
blossoming into adulthood.
But it means that in my life, I've twice been assessed by a psychiatrist and told that I'm okay, that I'm not suffering from any mental illness, including post-traumatic stress disorder, which was quite a shock to me in the 90s when I was assessed and wasn't suffering from it, because I bloody well should have been, given what Scientology were doing at the time. But this psychiatrist then said, you know, but if you want to come and chat sometimes, then do that. So over the next 5 years till I was 18, every now and then, every couple of weeks, every month, I'd go and play her my Led Zeppelin records, and she'd do that. And we'd talk about Emily Dickinson, and I'd read her my Vogon poetry. So when I got into Scientology and I was told that all psychiatrists are evil, I was like, no, she was really friendly, actually. And that was something, you know, and then they had Thomas Satz, who they trotted forward, who was a psychiatrist. I'm not going to mention the name of the other person. I know he doesn't want to be mentioned publicly, but there was another psychiatrist who was not a Scientologist, who was an anti-psychiatry psychiatrist that they were involved with. But nonetheless, this notion that, you know, in Scientology, Hubbard says the psychiatrists are basically this cult that have existed, you know, since way before there was any history, and their intention is to destroy all life. And why? I'm not sure. You know, maybe they're.
Yeah, I've never. That gets us right into our last point. Dispensing of existence, and the idea that a group of people, or even just one person, is somehow evil, bad, and just wrong, based not on their actions, but on membership of a group, or not being one of our people.
They're not pure enough.
They're not pure enough. They're not one of us. They're not with us. They must be against us.
Dispensing of existence there's a spectrum from not caring what happens to another person, through to actively destroying them. So again, Lifton's Destroying the World to Save It, about Aum Shinrikyo, where one of the most poignant stories is that of a heart surgeon, a well-known heart surgeon, who murdered people on behalf of the leader, Osahara. And their intention, of course, was they stockpiled enough sarin gas to kill 4 million people. And they were intent on forcing the reincarnation of the Japanese people. The doctrine is called Poa in Buddhism, and it's a stupid idea. But the idea is they live out all of their bad karma in one go, in choking to death on the nerve gas. And then they'll all be reborn splendidly.
My group had a similar idea, though we only killed the people spiritually. In fact, people I didn't know. I was at one point, I was instructed to write down a spell and stick it into somebody's book bag. And I was willing to do this because my leader had told me that this person was bad and deserving of utter destruction. And so I wrote down this little spell and put him in the book bag. Now, according to my leader, that would kill them utterly and just leave a shell of a body, whereas they just went, what the is this? But you see it also in, unfortunately, the ex cult community, where I was just dealing with somebody today where there's this very toxic person who's been hurting a lot of people. And I had to let somebody know, hey, this person has been bad-mouthing you on this site. And this person was delighted to find out that this person is having a hard time. They're delighted that this person is in pain. And even when it's somebody that I don't like, I'm not going to be delighted that they're in pain. I am not delighted to hear that Trump is spiraling down into dementia and having a hard time of it, because yes, I hate everything but I will not celebrate his pain.
Hate the sin, but love the sinner.
Yeah, only that has been
anybody
misused so much. But I will, the idea that these people somehow deserve pain and punishment.
That whole sense of revenge. I think, talking about etymology, the word punishment is means to give pain to somebody.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean to correct them, to put them right, or to redeem them. It means.
And what does that do? It just drags. If I start going so angry that I need to wish pain on somebody, that drags me down.
And there's a lot of discussion, and I've seen it a few times, about anger and whether anger can be a positive thing. And my perspective is that indignation is a positive thing, but rage, however it's expressed, will be a bad thing. And that taking revenge, it's where the vendetta culture, the blood feud, it's where we start to become human, where we can overcome that sense of revenge. But if anybody messes with my kids, then I will have them.
Yeah, well, I mean, like you were saying, the Andy Noakes thing is your favorite thing. I don't like it. I had a hard time editing all of that because I really have a hard time with anybody insulting you or any of my friends. I mean, you want to see Spike's eyes turn red, insult John or Wally, my husband, or any of my friends. You'll see me go, oh. But I don't like that feeling. And I know that I'm better than that. But in dispensing of existence, it's almost this institutionalized, those people are evil and let's make sure that we crush them down.
Well, if you look at the way that ISIS or ISIL have behaved, that the horror stories that have come out of Syria and Iraq, where because there is a prohibition on homosexuality, and it is said, I believe, in the Quran that homosexuals should be thrown from hilltops, they were actually taking them up apartment blocks and throwing them out. And this sense of righteous self-justification, which is just hatred, it's something that has to be, if we are to grow up as a species, and I don't think we've done a very good job of it so far, but we do have a tremendous potential, I believe. If we are to grow up as a species, then we are going to have to understand that hurting people is not beneficial, right through to if we're dealing with mass murderers, serial killers, that they should be, we should make sure they cannot carry on doing this. So Hannibal Lecter comes round, you should put a mask on him so he doesn't bite your nose off.
And once again, it's a black and white thinking. Oh, we don't want to hurt these serial killers. Oh, then you mean they should be able to do anything they want. Like, no. There is a difference between restraining them, keeping them away, and shouting and singing, hallelujah, let's let him fry, man, on Electric Birdie or whatever the name of the electric chair is.
And to see the glorification of violence. He said that Voltaire was the first person to protest the use of ritual torture in the execution process. I find that impossible to believe, but I don't know of any earlier. And at that time, he would be protesting, the early 18th century, hanging, drawing, and quartering, where and people would turn out and they'd have a great celebration about around the killing of somebody, which would start at dawn and end at twilight. So if you were going to going to happen, do it in December, towards the end of December, so at least it'll be 6 hours. But that within human beings, which wants retribution, absolutely restrains somebody if they've done something criminal. And when Myra Hindley, the Moors murderess, a friend of mine was sued by Myra Hindley. She'd written a book about her, a biography, and Myra Hindley sued her. And the judge said, given what she and her partner had done to innocent children, there was nothing that could be said about her that would defame her, because what she had done was worse than anything. And she went through all of this rigmarole about wanting to be released, and eventually in claiming that she wasn't responsible for any of these things. And then when it was suggested that her sentence might be in some way commuted if she helped find the missing bodies, she suddenly remembered where they might be. But the point was that when maybe if you kill one person, a crime of passion or what have you, it is safe to release you back into society at some point. But when somebody is systematically killed, then they need to be restrained and taken out of the population, and their influence upon the population needs to be restricted.
But that is not to say that we take a whole class of people and decide that these people are less than human, which is the whole essence of dispensing of existence.
Yes, it's to deny humanity to people. And when it happens in genocide, it's been remarked often that the people who are the subject of genocide will be treated as vermin. They'll be, Jews were called rats by the Nazis. The same has happened wherever there's a genocide, that these people are subhuman. And of course, in opening our minds, I give a few examples of military commanders. The Australian military commander who said that the Japanese were just monkeys. Japanese commanders were told that the Chinese were just monkeys. And racism in the United States and
where I was, they're just savages. They're just godless heathen savages or Indians. Mud people. All of the words for the systematic theft and erasure of an entire continent of people.
Yeah, I mean the genocide of tens of peoples in what is now Canada and United States, Central America and South America. But so it robs us of our humanity if we wish to dispense of the existence of others, and we should do what we can. If you find yourself in a group that is wanting to do that, then get out and do something else.
What was it? The Wordsworth quote, "He who demeans another demeans me," or demeans all of us?
I'm not sure.
Rusty on my Wordsworth, I must say.
Go and look that up. And something about a host of golden daffodils, wasn't it? He who demeans a daffodil demeans all daffodils. Justice anywhere is injustice everywhere.
Yes.
So we've had our libtard conversation here.
And it only took us almost 2 hours.
Yeah, well, that's fair enough. We can always split it in half.
Yeah.
And we hope that this has been informative, but this is a taster. Losing reality, start there. That's a very good place to start. Destroying the world to save it, to look at these ideas, which are, and of course my own opening our minds, which I think are very helpful ideas in assessing human behavior and in seeing whether somebody is trying to enslave you. Of course, look at what we've said about gaslighting and triangulation and the various methods that are used in such cases as well.
Well, these 8 can go from a whole country to just a family or even a single relationship. If any of these are being applied to the point where that's the only way that you can interact, then you are in a situation that you should not be in.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's leave it at that. I have been John Atack.
And I've been Spike Robinson.
And we will probably continue being so for a little while yet. If you can afford to put a few dollars a month into Patreon, that's really useful. And it tells us that, you know, I really have been on the edge of quitting here for quite some time, from about the time we started, which is nearly 3 years ago now. Sort of wondering whether it's going to make any difference, whether anything is going to happen as a consequence of what we're doing. And there are subscriptions that will show us that people are interested, and we're 3,400.
And you get little goodies, like you get these videos released up to a week ahead of time, or even just a few days, depending on how fast I can edit them. You get a free live stream with this guy pick his brains once a month at least. We're going to have our next one on May 1st. And all sorts of things. I'm still working on convincing you that we need John Atack, the mouse pad, John Atack, the coffee mug, and
good idea. Yeah. The hoodie.
Yeah, John Atack, the hoodie. You know, we don't have merch yet, but I keep on trying to convince this man.
Yeah. Just, you know, put $1 in the box. You know, give us $5, $10, whatever a month, whatever you can manage.
But also take a look at all of these playlists, especially the essentials, where we have broken down all of this stuff. There is some gold in there.
Yeah, don't just treat this as a kind of newspaper or something that's coming along. Please dive into.
This is an encyclopedia.
Yeah, so it's a library of material, and you know, we will keep hitting onto the same topics. Because they are the topics, the central topic being human predators and the authoritarianism that they spread all about them.
And these models of manipulation that they have. Yeah.
By understanding these things, I genuinely, the reason I do still do this, I genuinely believe that we can make a better world. But without understanding these things, you know, it's this process. We cannot save the environment as long as war is being fought.
Yeah,
because war is going to destroy the environment.
Yeah.
Whoever's waging it, and we cannot stop war until such time as we understand why people can be so emotionally driven that they are. You know, I was watching an interview with a Ukrainian woman who was saying this Russian soldier and his friends were saying, you know, we've come to liberate you. And you look around and you go, you've liberated us by completely flattening.
Yeah, you liberated me from my apartment, my supply chain, and my family. Thanks.
Yeah, so but people who believe absurdities will commit atrocities. Voltaire comes back into the conversation again.
Yes, indeed.
That's that. So thank you very much. Somebody wanted me to sing "Thank you for listening" at the end of a video.
Oh, please don't.
And I write just for you. No, you don't. What a liar. He doesn't even know who I am. But yes, thank you for your time, for sharing time with us. And we will see you again very soon, I hope. And I hope that your life is enjoyable and fulfilling. And that you have the happiness of helping other people, which is what happiness is. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.
I have learned from my mistakes. So there's not one of them that I could not repeat exactly.